Okay, just gonna give everyone a few minutes to come into the live and also till I get the go ahead from Emily. Also, I've got a funky new setup today. Keep changing locations here in Lebanon. So this is my makeshift studio for the day. Just waiting to get the go ahead from Emily. I think we should be just okay. I'm live. Yay, here we go, everyone. Hello, I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches live on Breakthrough News. Israel says its war on Lebanon is about security, but Israeli politicians and media figures are openly calling to annex territory up to the Litani River and expel entire villages. So the question is this really about Hezbollah or about expanding Israel's borders? Let's get into it. We've now entered week 3 of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran and Lebanon. So far, Israel has killed more than 800 Lebanese, including over 100 children, and they've displaced over 1 million people scattered across the country, and they're telling them they may never be able to go home. Israel's now preparing to expand its ground invasion. Israeli officials say the goal is simply to guarantee security for residents in northern Israel by clearing out border villages, disarming Hezbollah, and creating what they call a buffer zone. But that framing hides something deeper, because this isn't a new story. Since Israel's creation, Zionist leaders have repeatedly looked to southern Lebanon as part of their territorial ambitions. That history helps explain the repeated Israeli invasions and occupations of Lebanon long before Hezbollah existed. And today, many Israeli leaders are saying quite openly what the long-term goal is: control of territory beyond their borders. So what exactly does Israel want in Lebanon, and why has this project repeatedly failed? To discuss all of this, I'm joined by historian Zachary Foster. He's also founder of Palestine Nexus. Zachary, welcome back to Dispatches.
Rania, thanks so much for having me back.
Well, I'm really excited to get into this with you. We're going to be talking about the country I'm sitting in right now, which is Lebanon, and Israel's expansionist project that goes beyond just Palestine. Before I ask you my first questions, I do want to remind our audience that we here at Breakthrough News are an independent media outlet, and I am able to bring you programs like the Dispatches and all of the other excellent journalism that we do here because of support from our audience. So if you are able to, please consider becoming a member by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. But most importantly, you'll be helping independent media at a crucial time. I also want to remind everybody to make sure they smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Make sure you engage with the content. Make sure you're commenting, even if it's just to say hi. All right, Zachary. I think a good place to start is that, as I mentioned in the opening, Israel has launched this massive escalation against Lebanon. I'm sure, I know you've been following the news, this bombing relentlessly more than 2 weeks now. And of course, they've expanded their ground invasion. And they've reportedly called up 450,000 reservists, suggesting, preparations for a much wider campaign. And what I want to talk to you about is the fact that this is far from the first time Israel's invaded Lebanon. There's a very lengthy history of Israeli invasions, occupations, massacres, military interventions into this country. So before we get into what Zionism seeks in Lebanon today, I'm wondering if you could walk us through the timeline of Israeli invasions of Lebanon, because there have been quite a few. I mean, you have a few tweets where you've actually kind of put up a timeline, and I do want to eventually put one of those up, but it's just so long. So I'm going to let you take it from here. We can talk about maybe those years of invasions, and then we can talk about the history, the lineage of Zionism's desires for Lebanon.
The story begins before 1948. You had Zionist military officials who were sent by the British actually to Lebanon in the 1940s. You had 32 Haganah officers and fighters sent from Haifa in the early 1940s to sabotage oil facilities in Lebanon. And then in 1948, of course, the infamous 1948 war, in which Israel ethnically cleansed about 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. Towards the end of that war, in October, November 1948, Israeli forces entered Lebanon, conquered about 12 Shia villages in the south, actually pushed forward to the north with plans of conquering the entirety of the region south of the Litani River. They were forced back to the Ras al Naqoura line during the negotiations, the armistice agreements that were reached in 1949. But Ben Gurion said during the fighting in early 1948, in March, April, May 1940, he said the plan was to occupy Lebanese territory south of the Litani River. That was the plan in 1948, and it was only through diplomatic pressure that Israel was forced back across the border. But that, of course, didn't stop Israel from fortifying the border, from depopulating Lebanese and Palestinian towns along both sides of the border beyond the armistice agreement. For example, Bireim, Ikrit, multiple villages along the Lebanese border were depopulated in 1949. So this is after the end of the war. And then throughout the 1950s, you have Israeli leaders, in particular Moshe Dayan, who was chief of the IDF staff. Then he became defense minister in the 60s. This is the infamous Israeli general who lost an eye in 1941 on Lebanese soil when he was sent by the Haganah, the Zionist militia in British Mandatory Palestine, to carry out operations in Lebanon. And he had a long-standing interest in taking over South Lebanon, in part because the Litani River was believed to be critical to secure Israel's future water resources. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, Israel had about 1,600 million cubic meters of water. The Litani River alone would increase that amount by 50%, adding another 800 million cubic meters of water. So you're talking about a 50% increase in Israel's access to water. And so you have meetings in Israeli security cabinet meetings between Moshe Dayan and Ben Gurion all the way going back to the 50s, in which they're talking about taking over Lebanon and the plan, taking over South Lebanon, south of the Litani River. The plan was to then install a Christian state north of the Litani River, based on this longstanding belief among Israeli political and military leaders that it's critical to install friendly regimes, regimes that will do Israel's bidding in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria. This is the Israeli military doctrine going back decades and decades, right? We want to install friendly regimes. That was the plan in Lebanon. We're going to install a Maronite leader. And you even have Moshe Dayan saying this will be easy to achieve, right? We'll just find some general, we'll find some captain, could be a low-level officer. We'll put him in charge. We'll give him some money. We'll give him weapons, and he'll rule Lebanon for us. And that was the plan. And then, of course, that never materialized. But with the advent of the PLO based in Lebanon already in the late 1960s, and you have all these cross-border raids, Israel's interest in Lebanon is once again renewed. And throughout the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, you have cross-border raids, attacks on Lebanon. This is long before there's any organization known as Hezbollah in Lebanon. They don't come about until 1982. In 1976, Israel actually invades Lebanon, kills about 1,000 Lebanese. Let's back up. In 1976, Israel actually crosses the border, takes control over 3 Lebanese villages. These are Christian Lebanese villages. This is in the aftermath of the civil war that breaks out in Lebanon. So again, this is before the 1978 invasion. People don't even know about this invasion, but Israel exploits this crisis in Lebanon, the outbreak of the civil war, in which the Lebanese government is divided and fractured, and the Lebanese army is totally unable to protect the south. Israel takes over a few villages in the south, does the same thing in 1978 with a full-on invasion, killing 1,000 Lebanese. And this is really the beginning of Israel's domination in Lebanon, because although it's forced to withdraw back to the border, owing to pressure by U.S. President at the time, Jimmy Carter, who says, you need to withdraw. And he actually threatens at the time in 1978, he threatens to cut off Israel from U.S. military aid. This is in 1978. So Israel withdraws, but manages to install a collaborationist militia, the SLA, in South Lebanon. And this is the setup for 1982, right? And so basically between 1978 and 1982, Israel's crossing the border at will and to collaborate with this Maronite militia based in South Lebanon. And then, of course, what happens in 1982, Israel is fed up with the PLO. It wants to dominate Lebanon. And you even have some genocidal rhetoric coming from Israeli leaders during that invasion. We're going to wipe out Beirut. We're going to destroy them. We're going to level Lebanon. And that's what Israel does, killing 19,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians, besieging Beirut for 10 weeks. I don't have to tell this history to you. And then in the aftermath of the war, Israel effectively imposes a 18-year-long military occupation of South Lebanon, creating a security zone in which 150,000 Lebanese are subject to belligerent Israeli military occupation. Rounded up, arbitrary detentions, torture, frequent aerial attacks on Lebanese villages in the south, and they're completely defenseless. The Lebanese government's completely absent. The Shiite population of the south, and there are also Lebanese villages in the south, right? This is a very diverse country. They are subject to Israeli domination for nearly 2 decades, after which point the Israelis realize it's basically a disaster. They're just bleeding troops. They're facing heavy resistance. Hezbollah is formed in the aftermath of Israel's occupation of South Lebanon. And with support from Iran, they're co-religionists. They build a militia to resist Israeli domination and Israeli occupation in South Lebanon. And then you have the 2006 war, in which Israel tries to, again, take over South Lebanon again, faces heavy resistance, forced behind, back behind the Ras al-Quds border. The U.S. Government, the Pentagon, assesses this to be a military disaster. Israel could not take over much Lebanese territory. And then the same thing happens in the 2024 war, in which Israel tried again to conquer Lebanon. They were forced into a ceasefire in November. And ever since November 2024, when Israel signed a ceasefire agreement agreeing to stop firing at Lebanon, they've slaughtered hundreds upon hundreds of Lebanese, mostly civilians. They've continued to maintain about 5 security points in Lebanon during this period from September 2024 until November, from November 2024 all the way to the present day, in which, as we just saw over the past 2 weeks, as you pointed out in the intro to this stream, Israel has once again, for the 4th or 5th time, invaded Lebanon with the stated declaration of controlling all Lebanese territory south of the Litani River. We're talking a massive chunk of Lebanese territory. And Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz just said the other day, no one's going to be allowed back. And he even likened the situation to Gaza. He said, we will do in South Lebanon what we did in Beit Lahia and Rafah. Well, if you want to pull up a picture of what Rafah looks like, he's threatening genocide. He's threatening to carry out a genocide on the people of Lebanon.
No, I mean, that was a lot of really important information. And what I hear when I hear you going through each of those times that Israel has done what it's done since before its founding, I just hear like a Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over and over again. Many things stand out. You mentioned the weak Lebanese government, like kind of leaving the people of the South totally unprotected and on their own. You mentioned the reasons given are interesting, right? Because you mentioned Israel really gets into its most violent in the 70s. And of course, back in that time, Israel would say that it had to do this for security because Palestinians were firing at them from Lebanon. That was the excuse given. And, a lot of Lebanese fell for it, even people in the South. Like, they got annoyed. They were like, why do these Palestinians keep firing from here? But I just want to go back to the fact that Israel has created the conditions for all of this. Like, Palestinians were firing at what then became Israel because Israel had stolen their land. They were refugees that were pushed into Lebanon, trying to get back to their land and trying to use armed resistance to regain their land. And that would not have happened had Israel not ethnically cleansed all the Palestinians from Palestine that they did, many of whom ended up in Lebanon. And then you can say the same thing about Hezbollah now. Hezbollah comes, into being because of Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon in the 80s with help from Iran, obviously, no one's denying that. But the fact of the matter is that you don't have that group unless, without the conditions Israel created, because obviously people are going to get pissed off if you steal their land, if you kill their families, and if you demolish their homes. And that's all Israel's ever done. And so I really appreciate you going through that history because there's a narrative, not just in Lebanon, but really in Lebanon, where there's a delusion that if Hezbollah just didn't exist, Israel wouldn't be bombing us. Israel wouldn't be invading. And it's like, Israel was doing this before Hezbollah existed, and it was doing it before the PLO existed too. So, from there, I want to go, Zachary, to a different issue that is much related to this, which is what Israel really wants in Lebanon. You mentioned the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, who said, I believe it was yesterday, that the goal of this current war in Lebanon, he keeps saying, is to guarantee the security for Israel's northern residents by creating a buffer zone inside Lebanon, which is the excuse they give in Gaza, in Syria as well. But, you know, a lot of this also goes back in time as well. I just want to show this this headline. Hang on, let me share this. It's worth it. Which you had posted as well, from the Jerusalem Post. Here we go. Time to implement Ben-Gurion's vision. Litani River is Israel's natural northern border, right? And you mentioned Ben-Gurion saying that earlier. And what I want to emphasize in this piece is that it literally argues that Israel must control the territory up to the Litani River and resettle it with Jewish communities because security is only ensured with a Jewish civilian presence. And that means also depopulating the Lebanese presence that exists. And some Israeli figures are even being more explicit about this. We heard recently a former Likud MK and former IDF Deputy Chief of Staff, Uzi Dayan, calling for turning South Lebanon into a death zone for this exact purpose. Another Israeli politician, this religious Zionist, Zvi Zukat, recently said to conquer territory, destroy the villages, occupy the air territory, and annex it to the state of Israel, referring to Lebanon. And of course, all of this under the idea of security for Israel's residents. And then you also pointed out something really interesting based on this article that I have up right now from the Jerusalem Post. You said that Israel's military doctrine since 1948 has been that Israel decides what kind of government there shall be in Lebanon and where its southern border shall be. That's what David Ben-Gurion told his general just a week after Israel's establishment. So I want you to maybe elaborate a bit on Ben-Gurion and early Zionist leaders and what they envisioned for Lebanon and how much of Israel's strategy toward Lebanon today reflects those early ideas.
So Ben-Gurion's vision for the borders of the state of Israel was outlined actually long before 1948. He co-authored a book published in Yiddish in 1918 with the Yitzhak Ben Zvi, who was, I believe, one of the first presidents of the state of Israel in the 1950s. And in the book, they identify Israel's northern border as the Litani River. And Ben-Gurion says similar things throughout the 1930s that, and recall that actually the northern border of British Mandatory Palestine is, of course, not the Litani River. It's the Ras El Nakuda line, which is dozens of kilometers south of the Litani River. But for Ben-Gurion, the goal was to determine not just where the Palestinians would wind up after the war, right? They want to push Palestinians out of the eventual Jewish state. But of course, the goal is also to determine what kinds of regimes will exist in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon, and of course in Egypt. Israel has long sought to influence the internal politics of its neighbors. And so Lebanon, I think, chief among them, because Lebanon has been this multicultural, a diverse society for many, many decades. And Israel has long sought in places like Lebanon to install what it perceived to be sort of natural allies, people that at least it perceived to be aligned with. That would be, of course, the Christians in Lebanon, primarily the Maronites, who Israel thought were effectively natural allies, right? They looked to the minorities in places like Lebanon and Syria as potential allies. They've, of course, had this long vision to try and empower Kurds in Syria, similar idea. They've wanted to empower Maronites in Lebanon based on this belief that a Maronite government in Lebanon would provide Israel the security that it wants, and it would support Israel's expansionist interests. Of course, the Maronites had no interest in South Lebanon. I mean, going back to the Lebanese states and the Lebanese governments from the 1940s onwards, when Lebanon first gained independence, you had a Christian-dominated government, right? The classic 6-5 balance in which Christians controlled the government, and in which Shias were effectively completely left out of politics. There was no investment in the South. The Shiites were completely neglected by the state. No state investment, no funding for schools or for roads or for clinics or for civilian infrastructure. They were abandoned by the state, and that became all the more obvious in the 1970s during the Civil War and beyond in the 1980s. And so what happened? You had a group that became known as Hezbollah that came to prominence to defend the interests of that population at a time when it was being completely neglected by the state. But going back to the question that you asked, as far as Israel's interest in establishing a Maronite state in Lebanon, that was Ben Gurion's interest, that was Moshe Dayan's interest. And that interest, you could say, carries through all the way to the present day when you have Israel trying to build alliances with Lebanese President Aoun in an attempt to suppress Hezbollah and suppress any resistance to Israeli domination in Lebanon.
Yeah, and I'm trying to pull up something that I want to show because, okay, so here in Lebanon, we are subject to something very obnoxious, which is these Israeli Arabic language spokespeople, and the people of Gaza have had to deal with this as well, where they issue these, like, they call them evacuation warnings, but they're actually displacement warnings, or forced displacement orders, I should say, where they're essentially forcing people to like, they're saying, leave your home. This is now a death zone. So I just want to share, this is like an order that was issued online. Like, we have to basically have them on Twitter alert. That's the only way, like, sometimes they'll be like, oh, this building has, they'll like put a building in red and be like, you have to evacuate this building. And they'll do it at like 2 a.m. So if you're awake and lucky enough to see it and you're in that building, hopefully you left the building. So that's one way they'll issue these displacement orders. Another way is they'll put entire areas of the country under forced displacement. And so here is, here we go. Here is the forced displacement order. It's basically saying that everybody south of the Litani River is at the top of that area in red. I like how I'm pointing at it like anyone can see my finger, but where those yellow arrows are, everybody in that red zone needs to go north. That's a huge chunk of Lebanon. And that's that top border of it is the Litani River. So they're saying that entire area of the south is now a kill zone. So if you don't heed their warnings and leave, if they kill you and you're a civilian, oh well, which is of course against international law. This is very similar to what they did to Gaza. And they're promising to turn that area of South Lebanon that you see in red into Gaza. And that's the area that Israel seeks for its, like, grand, I guess, greater Israel that you're talking about. And I just want people to see visually what that means. And actually, they recently have been posting even north of that. There's another river called the Zahrani River, which is even north of the Litani, and they're saying everybody must flee even higher. And then yesterday, the defense minister, Israel Katz, said the Shia population of southern Lebanon cannot return to that red area until Israelis feel safe, which means never, because the Israelis will never feel safe if there are Arabs at their border who they are constantly killing, who will fight back. But all that's to say, I did want to talk to you a bit about Greater Israel. I want to play a clip of, I know you know who this guy is, Ilan Levy. We haven't, seen him as much lately, but I think he's a British citizen, but also Israeli, just a total settler. He is a far right, I would say, propagandist for the state of Israel. And he was recently on a show with another interesting character called Mario Nathal, but that's not the point of showing this video. I want to show this video because he makes a claim in it that I think is hilarious. And then I want to get your response. So hang on, I'm adding this video file in here so we can watch. Here we go.
The viral argument that I see mainly on Twitter that Israel is somehow interested in extending its territory from the Nile to the Euphrates is such an absurd hoax that if you ask Israelis, what do you think of Greater Israel, they assume that you're talking about Judea and Samaria. They don't realize there's a whole corner of the internet that thinks that Israel wants to extend from Egypt.
What about Ben Gvir and Smotrich? I know they like to be dismissed, but they're still members of the government as well. So they're significant people with a significant following.
And absolutely none of them are talking about extending Israel's territorial control beyond the original mandate borders that were assigned as a Jewish state by the League of Nations. The idea that Israel has this vision of taking over the Middle East is part of the same whole hive of conspiracy theories and hoaxes we've seen all over the internet. The fact is, Israel and Lebanon should be at peace.
I mean, I think he should have a conversation with U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who recently delved into the conspiracy theory of Israel's control over the whole region. But yeah, I'm wondering, this is me being a bit, silly, but is it really a conspiracy theory, Zachary, that, about greater Israel, or does it have roots in Zionist ideology and Israeli political history?
There's a few very important points to make here. The first 2 points have to do with the nature of Israel's military doctrine, its security doctrine. And this doctrine in 1948 set out to not define Israel's borders. There was never any declaration after 1948 or since. In the past 78 years, the state of Israel has never declared its borders. That's because Israel has long been unsatisfied with its borders. It was unsatisfied with the Peel Commission proposal to partition Palestine. It was unsatisfied with the UN partition proposal of 1947. Israel was also unsatisfied with the 1949 armistice agreement borders. That's, of course, why they're armistice agreements. They're not political borders. And every Israeli leader from 1948 to 1967 emphasized that those were just armistice lines. They were not political borders. And throughout the 1940s and 50s and 60s, Israel proved that those were just armistice lines. For example, in every border region, right? Starting in the north, as we already said, Israel depopulated border villages. Going to the Syrian DMZ zone, Israel was constantly encroaching on those no man zones. In Israel's border with the West Bank from 49 to 67, Israel's constantly taking over acre by acre in the Latrun area, that Latrun salient, that little finger that jets out into Israel, that was part of the West Bank. Israel's also trying to take over no man's land in the Jerusalem area. Again, this is at a time when Israel's at peace, right? There's no war. Israel is just inching and taking over acre by acre, dunham by dunham in the no man lands, in the West Bank, in the Syrian DMZ zone, and also in the Gaza border region. Israel is pushing the limits of that armistice line with Egypt. And in fact, Israel has, of course, desire and ambition for what shall happen to Palestinians beyond its borders, right? This is the other important key piece of Israel's security doctrine. It's not just that there's no borders. It's that we decide what will happen to Palestinians and Lebanese beyond our borders. Throughout the early 1950s, Israel's trying to expel Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip into Sinai, into Egypt. Maybe they'll get sent off to Jordan. At a time when it's Egypt that's controlling Gaza, Israel is working with the United States on getting Palestinians out of Gaza. There's this idea that Israel has long been interested in maintaining its borders within the 48 borders is nonsense. And then, of course, in the 1960s, in 1963, after Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol is elected prime minister, he has a meeting with his deputy chief of staff, who later becomes chief of staff. His name is Yitzhak Rabin. And Yitzhak Rabin pitches to Prime Minister Eshkol Israel's ideal borders. And it's all of British Mandatory Palestine. It's the entirety of the West Bank. It's obviously Gaza. And I believe he actually calls the Litani. He says, ideally, we'll go up to the Litani. That's in 1963. And then, of course, what happens in the weeks leading up to the 1967 war, in which Israel there's escalating tension between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Syria. Egypt moves forces into the Sinai Peninsula based on false information that the Soviets had provided them, that there was an Israeli threat on Syria. Israel, of course, does not see this as a crisis, but as an opportunity. This was the opportunity that Israel has long sought for. And of course, if you go back to the 1970s, when all the Israeli security cabinet members came out and said the 1967 war was not a war of annihilation, there were no threats, the thought never even crossed our minds that we were on the verge of being annihilated. Israel seize the moment, seize the opportunity, understanding that it could wage this war of aggression against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and it could take over the remaining parts of British Mandatory Palestine, and of course beyond, right? In which Israel took over not just Gaza and the West Bank, but also Sinai and also the Golan Heights, like tripling the size of the country. I mean, the Sinai Peninsula is massive, right? It literally triples the size of the country. And of course, then plans on keeping, the plan was to keep Sinai. The plan was not to give Sinai back. And of course, Israel has now annexed the Golan Heights. In the past couple of years, Israel has moved into beyond the Golan Heights and has moved into, they've gotten, I think, 30, 40 kilometers outside of Damascus in the past year, have just bombed Syria at will, planning to presumably maintain Israeli occupation in Syria forever. Now they're planning on maintaining a permanent presence in South Lebanon forever. It's an expansionist state. There's no borders. It has ambitions for who shall live where, in what border regions, and in which states. And there's one final point I will make here, which is that, one of the core pieces of Israel's security doctrine from 48 to the present, even going back to the 36 to 39 revolt, this is going back before the establishment of the state of Israel, was that Arabs are an inherent security threat because the Zionist presence in Palestine is obviously antagonistic to Palestinians and generally speaking, Arabs in the Middle East. And Zionists have known that since the beginning, right? Because the whole project was, let's transform this country that's 95% Palestinian Arab into a Jewish paradise. Well, how do you do that? Well, you buy up land, and then you expel the Palestinians living on the land because they're the wrong religion. So the Zionists have understand that their project is deeply antagonistic towards the native population of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And so they understand that Arabs, wherever they are inherent threats. So they cannot exist in border areas. They cannot exist on the frontiers. They cannot exist anywhere where you have a border. So the whole so what do you have? You have an expansionist ideology which says we can't have Palestinians or Lebanese or Syrians on the borders, and we don't want to declare our borders either. And so then what happens is you take over land, you expel the Palestinians or the Lebanese or the Syrians living in that land. Then you move Israeli settlers into that land. That's what Israel did in the Golan. So Israel does in the West Bank and Gaza. And then you have a new border region. We have a new frontier zone. And now that new border region and that new frontier zone also needs to be depopulated. And then you depopulate that zone. Then you move settlers in. And now there's a new frontier. And then you have a new border zone that needs to be depopulated. And this is effectively a brief history, I think. If you have to sort of encapsulate and summarize and understand the essence of the Zionist project, it's settle land, depopulate border zones, settle more land, depopulate more border zones, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And it really mimics, it's like the American settler project, right? Like that's basically what the US did until they had Native Americans placed on these tiny little reservations that just got smaller and smaller. All of these frontiers, it's just endless expansion. And I think there's a mentality in Lebanon that Lebanese are somehow different than Palestinians because they're not the geographically, the ones that are geographically closest to what Israel considers its territory. But that said, the Israelis don't see us that differently or differently at all. Just to mention a few things about what you're talking about. There's always been Lebanese collaboration with the Israelis. You mentioned, trying to make Lebanon a Christian state. Even before Israel's founding, there were basically feudal Lebanese families who sold, because the area was just one big, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. There wasn't borders, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine. These weren't like specified countries. They were kind of like Virginia, Maryland, and DC. Like, let's think about it like that, right? But part of the same general area was actually called, by a lot of people, Greater Syria. But back then, you had a lot of feudal families based in Lebanon who sold land to, I think you would know this better than me. I want to say the Jewish Agency, but there might have been a different name for what I'm talking about at the time.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So that's all just to say, there's always been this kind of like Lebanese collaboration. And I think you could probably say that about all the areas of the region. There's always been collaboration, especially among the sort of feudal landowners or landowning class. And you see remnants of that today in this mentality, specifically in Lebanon, because it's such a diverse country, unlike, a place like Palestine's diverse, but not as multi-sect as a place like Lebanon is. And if Israel's brilliant at anything, in addition to killing babies, it's also very, very good at playing on the minority cards across the region. So whether it's like the Maronites of Lebanon, or even the Druze of historic Palestine or now Syria, as well as the Kurds across various countries that they've aligned themselves with, and on and on and on. And so they've really done a successful job of that in Lebanon, to the point where there's certain Lebanese who see the South as a Shia problem, and only a Shia problem. And who cares? It's the Shia, because there's a lot of anti-Shia sentiment across Lebanon. So who cares? They're just like the Shia of the South. Like they're ready to just give away the South. And it's a very, very sad state of affairs. I don't know if you want to say anything about that before I go on to the next topic.
I did want to make one quick point because you brought up these land sales by Lebanese merchants and landlords, capitalists, the most prominent of whom was the Sorsuk purchases. And the Sorsuks were a very prominent Lebanese family based in Beirut. I've actually spent some time in the Keslik archives where you have the files of the Sarsuk family, which documents their extensive land sales to the Zionist movement, to the Jewish Agency, as you correctly pointed out. And in those early decades, really from the 1890s to the 1900s and 1910s and 20s, a majority, I couldn't give you the precise figures, but a huge percentage of the land bought by the Zionist movement was actually bought from Lebanese landowners. And in fact, if you go back to, if you're in the Zionist archives and looking at kind of papers from the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, the Zionist movement is very worried that the Ottoman government is going to attach the northern districts of Palestine that are currently under Lebanese and Syrian authority. They're worried that they're going to put them under the administrative authority of Jerusalem, where the Jerusalem notables are much more hostile to Zionist land sales than are the Beiruti merchants who don't care as much. And so there's all this political wrangling in the late Ottoman period to ensure that the northern sections of Palestine, what is today Marjab and Amr, the Galilee, the Panhandle, right, all these parts of northern Palestine, they remain under the control of the Beirut subdistrict rather than the Jerusalem subdistrict. So this goes back many, many decades, going all the way back to the Ottoman period. And in fact, you had a Zionist office in Sidon, in Lebanon, in the late Ottoman period as well, because there was a belief that this would be part of the Jewish homeland. And in fact, much of the land that Zionist was able to purchase was not purchased in the kind of Palestine heartland, the West Bank, where you had the largest Palestinian population centers, right, in the mountainous interior, or what is today the West Bank, right, Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, Jenin, Nablus, Qalqilia, Tulkarm, right. These are the biggest population centers in Palestine. But Zionists were not able to buy land there because that land was primarily owned by sharecroppers under these communal land tenure structures known as the Musha'a land. And they were not able to buy that land, but they were able to buy the land that had fallen under the largest landowning families, primarily in places like Haifa, Beirut, Damascus, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. And again, like I said, the largest of those was based in Beirut, the Sarsuk family.
Amazing. I mean, it's just more evidence that landlords are no bueno.
That's right. I agree with that.
But that's like a really, really fascinating history that I think a lot of people are unaware of. I really appreciate you delving into that. And I really hope to the Lebanese who are watching, perhaps hate watching me, I hope you learned something. Zachary, I want to just very quickly, actually, before I show you a video, I want to just show people that you wrote out beautifully. I actually hope you turn this into like an article, because you wrote out very beautifully a lengthy tweet with links about, you say, a brief history of Israeli attempts to occupy Lebanon. And this is like a more in-depth version of everything that you've taken us through. And I just want to scroll down. Let's go ahead and scroll down. Just keeps going. Look at that. Keeps going. Keeps going. We're in the 70s now, 80s, like 90s. It just keeps going on and on until, we get to today. But I really appreciate that you did that. And I'm encouraging you to turn that into an accessible article. I think that would be really beneficial for a lot of people, because I don't think many people are familiar with that history. I think a lot of the last couple of years since the Gaza genocide started, people have become much more knowledgeable about Palestine, which is fantastic. But it's really, really important that we understand the Israeli settler colony as something that impacts the entire region and especially all of its neighbors. And I'm saying this specifically about Lebanon in this moment because, Israel's, expanding this ground invasion. It's terrorizing all of us here in Lebanon. It's the reason you keep seeing me with different backdrops and different cameras. But it's a really bleak moment. But, I wanted to also play this video, and then I have a question for you. Let me share this tab. So this is a video that was posted by the lovely Nicholas Sawaya, who is Lebanese. If you don't follow him on X, you absolutely should. And he notes, before I play the video, just for those who can only hear it, he says, with Israel's current invasion of Lebanon and the parallels to 1978, I've gone to the archives to rewatch footage from that invasion. Listen to this man and how similar his legitimate grievances were to those you hear today from Southerners. Not much has changed 48 years later. So let's go ahead and tell me if you can hear this.
Nobody's coming.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Did you hear that audio? Okay, great. I'm going to play this video for everyone. This is from 1978 in southern Lebanon.
Nobody's coming to help us. We have no bread, no food, not even water, no electricity, nothing. We are alone. We have nothing. We need everything, you see. We need help. Where is the Arab soldier? Where is the arm? Where is the 100 million of the people? We are the biggest country in the world. We can say that in the Middle East. We are 100 million
The Arab
of
people.
the Arab people, yes. And now at this moment we are alone. You see, we are only few people, few civil people, and we get the airplane and the tanks and armed ship. Everybody, Israel also, they are using everything to destroy the people. And now, if you like to come with me, I will show you where is the airplanes that are shooting the people. Exactly, you can see with your eyes. You see, that's what I like you to prove that to all the people, to all the world. We are in south of Lebanon alone, and we have no fucking government. I'm telling you that frankly now. Nobody is coming to help us.
So, I mean, you literally, the only difference between what you see here and what's happening today is the man is wearing different clothing from a different time. And, you know, the footage isn't in, you know, HD. But it's a very sad state of affairs. But I don't want to be, I mean, what's happening now is horrible, but I also want to be honest about the fact that Israel has rarely succeeded. It hasn't. I mean, Israel has invaded Lebanon so many times, it even occupied Lebanon for 15 years and was ultimately kicked out. So I want to ask if you could maybe talk about the fact that, you know, Israel keeps trying. It's got this dream. And, you know, I'm not saying nothing's guaranteed. You know, maybe this time around, Israel is able to annex. I hope it doesn't happen, but maybe. No one knows. We have to wait and see. But can you talk a bit about why up until now Israel has failed in this project?
Well, the reason Israel is not occupying Lebanon right now, or at least not very many, not much of it. I mean, we could start the story. I think the first major attempt Israel made to occupy South Lebanon was 1978. And that was their plan in 78, was to occupy South Lebanon. But then U.S. President Jimmy Carter forced Israel out and actually threatened to withhold to completely cut off U.S. arms shipments to Israel in the event that Israel would not withdraw its forces. I mean, Israel would probably have already occupied Lebanon long ago had it not been for U.S. diplomatic pressure. And then in the aftermath of the invasion of Beirut in 1982, Israel did in fact occupy Lebanon. But what happened? They were forced out because there was a resistance to Israeli occupation. That resistance came in the form of Amal and, of course, Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, with a support from its co-religionists in Iran, managed to bring an end to Israel's belligerent military occupation of South Lebanon. And you probably recall those videos of the prisoners freed from Israel's torture dungeons in the south that were managed by the SLA. But basically, Israel was forced out. They were forced out by force. It was because the Hezbollah militia was capable militarily of pushing them out. And that pressure lasted about 6 years until Israel got expansionist fever once again, tried their hand again at occupying Lebanon and failed again because it's a very difficult place to occupy. The local population doesn't want you there. The terrain is rugged. This is difficult mountainous land to cross. Your tanks are going to be targeted with rocket-propelled grenade launchers that Hezbollah can produce in the tens of thousands. These are light arms. These are munitions they can produce with ease. So Israel has never been a particularly effective fighting force on the ground. I mean, we've seen that over the past 2.5 years. They had 2.5 years to eliminate Hamas. We're talking about a ragtag fighting force of people producing weapons underground in a besieged territory, one of the most densely populated places on earth. And 2.5 years into a genocide, they're able to manufacture rockets underground that they're then able to fire at Israeli tanks 2.5 years into a genocide, or actually more like 2 years into the genocide. The ceasefire was signed in October 2025. But you're talking about a fighting force that has no weapons coming in from the outside, is completely blockaded from the outside world, is operating under the most intense conditions that any fighting force has probably ever operated under in all of human history, living in underground shelters, living in tunnels for 2 years, and Israel failed to defeat them. So Israel's fighting force, obviously they have an incredibly powerful air force. They can bomb civilians in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, with total impunity. But in terms of conquering and taking over land, in terms of occupying Palestinian villages or Lebanese villages or Syrian villages or Egyptian or Jordanian villages, Israel has a long and tired history of failure after failure after failure. They're not good at long wars. The infamous Israeli security doctrine is short, not long wars. We don't like long wars. We're a small country. We don't have that many fighters. It's a huge burden in our economy to call up these hundreds of thousands of reservists. It's taxing the civilian population at a huge level. And so Israel doesn't like long wars. And so Israel doesn't like prolonged military occupations. And so it seems to me quite unlikely that they're going to be able to take over Lebanon. It just strikes me as incredibly unlikely.
Yeah, and I mean, there's fierce battles taking place right now in places like Khiam and other border villages across southern Lebanon between Hezbollah and the Israelis. And I mean, if you read the Hebrew press, which I try to, skim in translation mode every morning, it's not easy for them. It's not going well for them in terms of being on the ground. I mean, we all know Israel has a more difficult time on the ground. However, what they are doing in conjunction with their ground invasion is they are obviously punishing Shia areas with carpet bombing. They're also bombing outside of the scope of areas they tend to generally bomb in wars on Lebanon, which is scaring the rest of the population. And it's meant to pressure people outside of what's considered Hezbollah's community to turn on Hezbollah and disarm them themselves. And they also have the Americans holding a gun to the head of the people who are in charge of the Lebanese government, saying either you basically disarm Hezbollah or Israel will occupy the country. And what that means to be asking the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah means essentially having the Lebanese army confront Hezbollah, which would be a civil war. They're asking Lebanese to either start a civil war or Israel occupies the south and destroys the country. That's the choice they're giving Lebanon today. And it's a very terrifying one. And it really harkens back to their tactics of the past that they're recycling. But man, now there's 1 million displaced people. They're also, using that against the country as well as a weapon because, having 1 million people displaced in the rest of the country in a country that's so sectarian and already has so much communal tension can lead to massive disasters. Did we lose? I think we lost Zachary, but let me just message him. But anyways, as I was saying, sorry, I'm opening my application here. Zachary. Sorry, guys, you're messaging Zachary with me. Hey, we lost you. Let's see if he comes back in. Hopefully he will. Can you come back in? Thanks for staying with me, guys. This is such a fascinating conversation, and I'm actually learning a lot from it myself because, okay, he's going to come back. Zachary has not left us for good. It was just a temporary exit. But no, this is such a fascinating conversation for me because just sitting here watching all of this happen around me in Lebanon, it's so interesting to hear, how much this is played over and over again. It's really history repeating itself. And, nothing is guaranteed. But at this point, I know people who followed me on Twitter or who are reading me on Substack know that I've expressed my criticisms of Hezbollah's decision to enter this war, and that I didn't think it was strategic or wise at all. But, that said, we'll see how it plays out. Oh, here, Zachary's coming back. Sorry. Hey, Zachary, let me finish this one thought. That said, I do recognize now that Lebanon has been invaded and people have a right to defend their villages. And it's crazy what's happening in Lebanon now, Zachary, because the Lebanese government is demanding on behalf of the US and Israel that people stop fighting Israel, as if they just lay down their weapons, Israel will just leave southern Lebanon and stop trying to invade. And that, history suggests that's not what's going to happen. Anyways, all that's to say, I want to ask you about a couple more things here before we wrap up, because I know I've had you for almost an hour, and I really appreciate your time and expertise on all of this. I want to kind of pivot a little bit, because another issue that's come up recently is the possibility of nuclear escalation. And you might have seen that tech billionaire David Sachs, who is a Trump advisor, warned in a video interview that if the war continues, he said, and this is David Sachs saying it, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but he said Israel could potentially, he's scared, use a nuclear weapon. I'm curious, how seriously should we take the possibility of nuclear escalation in this war? And here I'm talking about the Israelis versus Iran. I mean, I don't think the Israelis would use a nuclear weapon in Lebanon, because then they'd essentially be nuking themselves. But, there is something called the Samson option. I'm not sure if our audience is familiar with that. But yeah, given your understanding of Israel's nuclear doctrine, is this something that we should be concerned about?
Well, as far as I'm aware, this is the first utterance of a senior U.S. government official who stated without reservation that Israel has nuclear weapons. I mean, David Sachs is the AI and crypto czar under the Trump administration, and that places him very close to the commander-in-chief himself. And he said Israel has nuclear weapons. Is that a change in the official U.S. government position? I don't know. But we're in an extremely scary situation, Rania. I think we're at a greater risk of seeing a nuclear detonation go off in this war than we have been at any war previously, certainly since World War II, perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But let's review the facts. Israel has 200, 300 nuclear weapons. We don't know. They don't allow international weapons inspectors access to those sites because they don't have nuclear weapons officially. Israel, a few months ago, actually tested a nuclear weapon. There was a 4.2 magnitude earthquake that was detected, and the epicenter of that earthquake in Israel was in Dimona, coincidentally enough, which is where Israel's nuclear reactor is. So that's an interesting coincidence. And then, as you correctly pointed out, Israel has a nuclear doctrine. It's called the Samson option, in which it's stated military doctrines, it will use nuclear weapons if that as a last resort. There has also been reports that Israeli leaders have threatened to use nuclear weapons in the past as a way to draw in the United States into a military engagement. Well, if you don't engage Iran, if you don't engage Iraq, if you don't engage this, that, or the other, we are going to use nuclear weapons. So they also use it as a threat to involve, to lure the Americans into military engagements in the Middle East. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you're dealing with a prime minister and a security cabinet and a parliament and a society that is Israeli Jewish society that has proven itself totally indifferent to mass extermination of human life. So when you combine the nuclear doctrine with the nuclear tests, and we forgot to mention, in 2024, there was reports by Reuters that Israel was actually expanding its nuclear facilities in Dimona. They were constructing new edifices and new buildings in the Dimona nuclear complex.
Wow.
So when you add all this up, we're talking about a government, and then we haven't even mentioned Bibi Netanyahu's personal issues, his 4 cases of bribery and corruption and breach of public trust. So he is facing a tremendous amount of risk at a personal level that he might wind up in prison if he's no longer prime minister. So it's a genocidal country and society. It's a prime minister hell-bent on forever rule to avoid any kind of accountability for his failure on October 7th, for his corruption and bribery and breach of public trust charges. And then on top of that, it's layered on top of that, all of these nuclear doctrines and nuclear tests and nuclear expansions of the nuclear facilities. On top of that, we know that this war is not going very well for Trump, and he's probably looking for an off-ramp. You saw the reporting that by DropSite, that although Steve Witkoff has been sending messages to Iranian foreign minister, the Iranian foreign minister is not replying to them. And that's because Iran has no interest in a ceasefire. Iran understands that a ceasefire now means another war in 3, 6, 9 months. So they are of the belief that we need to deal a major blow to the United States and to Israel. Such a blow so big that this will be the last war of aggression they wage on us, which means pain, which means economic pain, which means closure of the Straits of Hormuz, which means $200 price of a crude barrel of oil, which means inflation in the U.S., which means higher food prices and higher gas prices and higher prices of everything that involves oil, which is everything, and higher prices that everything that involves natural gas, which is everything. So you're talking about a country, Iran, which is in the driver's seat, and you're talking, and so what that means is that where's the off ramp going to come from? How is Trump going to get out of this situation? But suppose he does manages to find an off ramp, then it's Israel by itself. Then it's Israel facing off with a power that has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic missiles that can degrade Israel's defense systems, that could attack the Israeli homeland, and they could do major damage to Israel. So when you add that into the picture, I can't think of a time in world history, I mean, save for perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis and World War II, where we've been closer to the brink of war, to the brink of nuclear war, than we are right now.
That's a completely terrifying prospect. And I think you made it like, I mean, the way you phrased it as this is a country and a society that has demonstrated they're totally fine with mass extermination. The idea of nukes in their hands is very frightening. And then you think about Israel, like, I don't know if the Americans played a role, maybe they did, in murdering or in killing the top national security head in Iran, Ali Larijani. But there was some theories that the reason the Israelis killed him is to really kill any potential negotiating partner for the Trump administration, because they don't want any off ramps. They want this war to continue. And you had Joe Kent, a senior Trump advisor, essentially resign very publicly today and writing a letter saying he feels very strongly that it was the Israelis that convinced Trump to go to war with Iran, and that there was no imminent threat, which we know the national security establishment in the U.S. said there was no imminent threat. So yeah, it just seems like pulling us all into apocalypse. And that's not to take any blame here off of the Americans at all, the completely incompetent administration of Donald Trump. But the Israelis played a huge role in making this war happen. I want to ask you a couple last things here, Zachary. One of which is, I wanted to ask you about another disturbing issue. In addition to demonstrating that they're totally fine with mass extermination, Israeli society has also demonstrated that they're okay with sexual violence. And we saw recently that the Israeli soldier who was captured on camera sexually torturing Palestinian detainees has now been released and celebrated by many top Israeli officials. And, this is a part of a pattern, like I said, of sexual violence as a tool of domination in this, ongoing conflict, ongoing genocide. It's been totally normalized. And I'm just curious what these acts do you think say about Israeli society and their military today?
Where to even begin? I mean, Israeli society, as far as I can tell, operates the largest network of rape dungeons in the world. Let me repeat that. I'm not aware of any evidence that has, of any compelling evidence of dozens, hundreds of reports from Palestinian prisoners, from quote unquote administrative detainees, people who have been abducted off the streets of the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. They're not charged with any crimes because they haven't committed a crime. That's why they're not charged with any crimes. They're actually charged with having committed a crime in the future. And therefore they can't present a legal defense. And so they're just locked up, and their detention is renewable potentially indefinitely. So we're talking about 10,000 of these Palestinian prisoners in Israel's torture dungeons. And you've had, at this point, a slew of reports from B'Tselem, from Palestine Children's Fund, from various UN bodies, UNHCR. There's no debate about this anymore. Every single one of these reports comes to the same conclusion. Rape, sexual harassment, sexual abuse is systematic. It's not a one-off here or there. You even had one case where a Palestinian prisoner came out of prison and said every time he asked to speak with his lawyer, they raped him. So he stopped asking to speak with his lawyer.
That's crazy.
And I mean, you just had a report in Haaretz yesterday describing a case where settlers sexually abused. So now it's beyond, it's not even, leave aside the prison rape, which, like we said, is systematic, where we have accounts of not dozens, but literally hundreds of Palestinians who have put their own name on their own testimony, saying, I was raped in prison. I was sexually abused in prison. This is on top of the starvation. This is on top of the physical abuse. This is on top of the psychological abuse. So that's happening in prison. And then outside of prison, you just had a case yesterday. This is in the settlement of Khumsa in the northern West Bank, in the northern Jordan Valley, where you had settler terrorists, a dozen of them, enter a Palestinian village and sexually abuse a 76-year-old Palestinian man in front of his kids. So this is happening literally daily now, not just in prison, but outside of prison. Not just by Israeli security forces, but by Israeli settler terrorists themselves, but by civilians. So you have this widespread sexual abuse, both in and out of prison. There was a case just the other day as well, by the way, Rania, of you have an Israeli minister. I forget which portfolio she is. We could pull this up, but she and her husband were reportedly or putatively, according to their daughter, who just committed suicide over the weekend, sexually abusing her entire childhood. And she came out on video a few months back. This is, I can't remember exactly when, but earlier in the year, maybe it was last year, she came out and basically with this video message kind of telling the world that she was sexually abused her entire childhood by her mother and her father. And her mother is a minister, a current minister sitting in the Israeli government.
So she's the minister of, is it settlements? Her name is daughter of the settlements minister.
That's right.
And I'm sorry, I'm pulling it up now. Sorry, continue. I just wanted to give you thank you. I saw some people sharing the story, but please continue because I didn't understand the details of it. But it's the settlements minister, Orit Strock. It's her daughter, right. Shoshana, who's 34 years old, was found dead. But go ahead and continue.
So here you have a 34-year-old woman who was sexually abused her whole life. And then after she came out publicly with reporting on this story of her own sexual abuse, she is obviously under intense pressure, right? Because she's exposing not just an Israeli minister, but her own mother. And there's a conspiracy. It's a family, and there's probably more people involved. It's not just her parents. So it's a conspiracy. And then she winds up dead, and she carries out and she commits suicide. Israel has a long history. We just saw there's a long history, by the way, also of Israeli Americans or dual nationals escaping to Israel to avoid charges of sexual abuse, to avoid charges that they would face in the United States. And this was the case earlier in, it was 2025. We had a case where a very prominent Israeli businessman fled the United States, fleeing charges of sexual, was it rape? Was it sexual abuse? I don't remember the exact charges. But this is a long-standing problem in the state of Israel. And again, it's very hard to wrap your head around why the society is just so sadistic. Why it is that you have, sexual harassers, sexual abusers, rapists, serial rapists. I mean, we could talk about the Epstein files, obviously, where you have the conflation of, a mass scale sexual abuse of young girls and women from Eastern Europe who are lured into this the Jeffrey Epstein's island, abused, harassed for years and years and years. And it's like everyone all the senior players in this Epstein circle are all either Israelis or they're Zionists or they're former Israeli prime ministers or they're Israeli lobbyists or they're Israeli spies or they're somehow connected to Israel. And of course, there's others connected that aren't connected to Israel, but there's somehow a preponderance of Israeli or Zionist leaders involved in this sex scandal. And it does make you ask questions. Why is society so deranged? Why are there so many sex scandals associated with Zionist leaders and Israeli prime ministers and Israeli ministers and Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans fleeing to Israel? It does raise questions, Rania.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does. And then you think about how they just want to liberate the women of Iran, and you wonder what that liberation, what that form of liberation would look like. In addition to bombing and destroying their country, it's like, is this what liberation looks like? Sex rings, pedophile sex rings. I don't know. Those are a lot of really good points. It's really horrifying and disturbing. There's one last thing I wanted to ask you about here, and that is, well, there was this recent attack on a synagogue, right, by this Lebanese man in Michigan, whose relatives had been killed by the Israelis in South Lebanon, and that included his brother and all of his brother's children. The Israelis have since claimed that his brother was a member of Hezbollah, was a Hezbollah fighter. But there's no evidence for that. And I just assume anything Israel says is a lie until proven otherwise. But even if he was, it wouldn't make it okay to murder his entire family. But that is what the Israelis do, right? But what was interesting was after this attempted attack, the man was killed by police and he wasn't, nobody ended up getting hurt. Obviously, it was very scary. But I found it interesting that commentators were immediately pointing out, I think you pointed this out as well, that this particular synagogue had been openly supporting Israel and basically like supporting the genocide in Gaza. And I'm not saying that justifies attacking it, but I am curious your thoughts on the way that mainstream Jewish spaces have been used and continue to be used to rally support for Israel's expanding genocidal policies, and what that has done, to mainstream Judaism in North America. And I'm saying this as somebody who obviously, like, I'm sitting here in Lebanon where the Israelis are bombing and invading, my family's country. And it's really, really, really scary here. And I'm somebody who's in a privileged position. I don't like live in an area where I've been, displaced, though I do keep kind of like moving from place to place because some places are a bit scarier than others and it's an inconvenience. But that I say that I'm asking you this not because I'm sitting here like making it a priority of like, oh no, what does this mean for Judaism? But I would assume, you come from a Jewish background, you should care about that. So anyways, all that's to say, I'm just curious your thoughts on all those things I mentioned.
Yeah, so much to say. Look, I grew up a few miles away from Temple, Israel in West Bloomfield, Michigan. So this does hit very close to home. Obviously, I would never support an attack on any religious institution, or for that matter, any civilian object of any kind, be it Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. Now, having said that, the basic problem here in the institutional Jewish world in the United States is that, and Israel, obviously, and the UK, and almost every other Jewish community in the world, is that these institutions are not really Jewish. They are Zionist. They raise Israeli flags on their properties. They sing prayers for the state of Israel in synagogue on Saturday morning. They also wish safety onto the soldiers, the soldiers of the Israeli army in synagogue on Saturday morning. That was the case in the shul I grew up in, just a few miles from Temple, Israel in West Bloomfield, Michigan. So they're wishing safety on soldiers accidentally sniping Palestinian children in the head twice. And then they're wondering why they're facing blowback. And then you have Israeli soldiers lighting the Hanukkah menorah in Gaza on the ruins of Gaza's unmarked graves. And then you have Israeli soldiers going into Jenin, setting up Rosh Hashanah dinner in the ruins of the Jenin refugee camp in September 2025. After they ethnically cleansed tens of thousands of Palestinians from the camp, now they're celebrating Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, inside the refugee camp. And then you have synagogues hosting fundraisers to sell land in the occupied West Bank that was stolen from Palestinians. And then you have the chief rabbi of the UK say that Zionism leaps off every page of the Siddur, which is the Jewish prayer book. So should I go write Free Palestine on the Siddur? Because it's a political book, not a religious book. So what you have is, and then of course you have synagogues, if you go to their websites, and I just posted about this, not one or two, but literally dozens of synagogues across the United States and in New Jersey and New York City and Florida and in Oregon, wherever you go, you have synagogues. You go to their websites, they have a list of helpful resources and helpful links. Donate to the Friends of the IDF. Now, can I ask you something, Rania? If you were an American and you discovered that a mosque in, I don't know, Texas or Michigan was raising money to send to the RSF forces in Sudan to help them slaughter thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Sudanese civilians in Al-Fajr, how would you feel?
So pretty pissed and horrified, yeah.
So we're talking about a society and a series of institutions that are deeply, deeply complicit in Israel's war crimes, in its apartheid regime, in its genocidal onslaught, in its wars of aggression in Lebanon and Iran. I'm sorry, like, if you want to raise an Israeli flag and wish safety on soldiers carrying out a genocide and sell land that's stolen from Palestinians, if you want to associate with apartheid and genocide, well, you better expect to face blowback. And that's not to justify the blowback, but that's just to be honest about cause and effect. If you're a historian studying the Holocaust and you're trying to understand what led to the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews, and you're trying to understand what it was that led to the Holocaust, you're not justifying those attacks. If you were, then we'd have hundreds of thousands of Jews and Israelis and Zionists who justify the murder of 6 million Jews. No, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to understand the context. We're trying to understand cause and effect, which is different than justifying. But that's exactly what these communities are doing. They're endangering their own members, putting them at risk by brandishing and identifying with and associating with the most genocidal country and society on planet Earth.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to put it. Listen, Zachary, I appreciate your scholarship so much, and I appreciate you for coming on once again to explain so much. And for those who tuned in later, like we spent the first half of this episode talking all about Lebanon. So if you missed that, please go back and check it out because it is full of so much important history. And I also want to remind everybody to please, if you haven't already, make sure you hit the like button. Hit the like button, you guys. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Also, consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. We are an independent media outlet, so we need your support. Zachary, can you tell everybody where they can follow your excellent work?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter /X_Zach Foster. But if you want to read my longer pieces, in-depth pieces, you can find all that, as well as the courses I offer on Palestine and Zionism and anti-Zionism. You can find all that at PalestineNexus.com.
And there's so many important pieces there. And I'm going to keep encouraging you to do one on Lebanon. Just take that tweet you put up and make it into a piece so that people can just keep looking at it. Zachary, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Rania.